Hey, thanks for joining again. I'm Bobby Dino, and welcome to another episode of Dino Talk. So today, we're going to be talking about the race game. What I mean by that is which different races were there in prison, and how did they interact, and what was the whole purpose of everything. Now, race classification is what happens when you first come in. So you come in, you see a counselor. The counselor is going to determine what your security level is, what you can and can't do in prison based on your crimes or past. And also, they're going to see what race you are. And they do that by asking, generally. They say, hey, are you white? Are you black? Are you Mexican? What are you? And you tell them. Now, California, I can't speak for other states or other pens because I only did time in California, but I will tell you this. It was the most racist environment that I've ever been in. Up until then, I was a kid from Orange County in LA. I had a bunch of different friends that were a bunch of different ethnicities. I was a rocker. I was in bands, like hanging out. And when I went into the joint, it was immediately a whole different type of world to me. You only stuck with your own. You weren't allowed to really be friends with other races. It was so strict that I'll give you an example. So let's say I was dying of thirst, right? And a black guy had a cup of water or something like that. I couldn't drink from that cup of water, especially if he'd already drank from it. Or let's say they were smoking a cigarette or something. I couldn't take a hit of that cigarette because a black guy had put his lips on it, or a Mexican guy or whatever. And the point being is, if I did do it, there were going to be repercussions. I could get my ass beat, I can get rolled up and kicked off the yard, sent to the hole, sent to the infirmary. You never know. But it was so racist that I had never experienced anything like it. When you go in, it's sticking with your own. That's it. Okay. Now, there were different races in there. There was the main ones were white, black. There were a few different types of Mexicans, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then there was a classification called other. Other included, let's say, Asian, Pacific Islanders, just races that didn't fall into white, black, or Mexican. They were classified as other, okay? Now, just because you were the same race didn't necessarily mean you ran together, okay? For the blacks, there was Bloods and Crips. Now, if something went down, like if there was a riot or something, yeah, they bunched up and they were, against whoever they had to go against. But just because you had the same skin color didn't necessarily mean like you were homies kicking it tough all the time. I'll give you an example. The Woods, okay, or the Whites, if you were just a regular white guy, you were referred to as a Wood. That's short for peckerwood. In other states, that's actually a derogatory term, but for some reason, the white guys in California snatched that up and they called themselves Woods, right? However, there were other white guys that were part of basically prison gangs. There was P9, which is a gang that ironically started out of Orange County, I believe. That's akin to skinheads. There's skinheads, okay, and they're their own thing. They're skinheads. They have their own creed that they believe in. There was a group called Nazi lowriders. They were, again, kind of like skinheads, but I believe they let like Mexicans and stuff in. Like, I don't know. I can't talk on them for sure. I wasn't a Nazi lowrider, and when I was in, if you were validated as a Nazi lowrider, you went to the hole. You went to SHU. You weren't allowed with the general population. That's it. Another one that was like that is the Aryan Brotherhood, or the AB. They were and still are a really gnarly group that has a lot of power, not only in prison, but on the streets as well. If you were validated as AB, you were in the hole, you were in the SHU, you were separated from the rest of the general population. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the blacks had the Bloods and the Crips. The Mexicans, this is the funny thing about the Mexicans, okay? There were so many Mexicans while I was in the joint. So everybody thinks, I know there's a popular misconception that it's like, oh, the brothers are just all locked up, or, oh, it's mostly this or that. No, check it out. You'd have a housing unit of like maybe, 300 dudes or whatever. 75 would be white, 75 would be black, and 150 would be Mexican. I mean, there were more Mexicans in California prisons, at least in my prison, and I was in the prison that had the highest population out of all the prisons in California. There were more Mexicans than anything. But the crazy part is the Mexicans were divided. So you had like Sureños, which Southsiders, Norteños, which are the guys from the north. You had Bulldogs, which was mainly a Fresno group. You had the Border Brothers, which were, it was a group that were like basically Mexicans that were either immigrants or whatever. And then you had what was called the Paisas, which were Mexicans that were from Mexico that didn't necessarily run with anyone, but they were Paisas. Kind of similar to how the Woods were, right? Except they were Mexican nationals that just, didn't decide to click up with any type of race, right? Now, if the Mexicans would have banded together, they would have ran the fucking joint. I mean, they outnumbered everyone, okay? If they would have all been just one unit instead of splitting up into a bunch of different groups, they would have ran the fucking place. But they didn't. They had their own issues and their own history that, while I may be aware of some of it or heard some of it, it's not my place to tell it, okay? One of the things, though, that kind of stuck out was that the Mexicans would run with different groups depending on what type of Mexicans they were. And what I mean by that is this. So the whites and the Southsiders or Sureños, they were allies, supposedly. They were allies. Now, the ironic part of that is most of the riots I got in were with Southsiders, but we'll get back to that in a minute. But the whites and the Southsiders were supposed to be allies. The blacks and the Norteños were supposed to be allies. So if something kicked off and they needed it, or like the shot callers got at each other or whatever, they'd back each other and fight for each other, right? That didn't necessarily happen all the time, but that's how it was supposed to be, okay? Now, let's get to the others. So if you weren't a white, black, or Mexican, you were classified as another. As mentioned earlier, others could be like Native American, they could be Asian, Samoan, Hawaiian, whichever. But it wasn't that they were part of a group per se. They could, in theory, sell or bunk with anyone, okay? Now, whether that happened or not depended on how they acted. So, for example, a lot of the Samoans, they acted like they were black, essentially. They'd call each other the N-word. They hung out with the blacks. So if you were a white guy, you didn't want to have a Samoan bunkie because the Samoans, like if something kicked off, your own bunkie might be against you because he's siding with the blacks and, you get stuck in the middle of the night or whatever. So it really depended. Native Americans generally, they were kind of even. They didn't side one way or the other. Asians were like that too. So Asians, it could go either way. You could have an Asian that acted more or less like he was a white guy, or you can have an Asian that acted more or less like he was a black guy. It just depended, okay? Now, just because another celled with a certain race, right, didn't mean that he had that race's back. So like, let's say your cellie or your bunkie was an Asian, right? It didn't mean that if the Asians went to war, you were going to fight for your bunkie. Now, if you liked your bunkie, okay, or you liked your cellie, and somebody came for him, like let's say they came to the cell, they tried to come up in the cell, run up in there and get him or whatever. I mean, if he was somebody that you got along with and you had a friendship with or something like that, if you wanted to, you could jump in. There might be repercussions, but probably not. And you could save his ass or whatever. But generally, if the Asians or if the others had something going on or whatever, that was their problem. Like you didn't want to get involved. Like if they had a problem with some guy and their own people came to handle it, you didn't want to jump in on that. And that's a lot of what everything was, is it was your own group, your own people. So for example, let's say a guy rolled up and he was a rapist or he was a chomo. Chomo is prison slang for child molester, right? It would be that dude's own race that got him. Okay, so someone checked his paperwork, or maybe he was exposed by whatever, and it was like, hey, this guy's a child molester. It would be that guy's race that took him out, or that handled their business. Because the races, when it came to any business that needed to be handled, they handled their own. Now, there is one exception to this, okay? Thieves. You could be a child molester, a rapist. It would be your own race that would have to handle you. But if you were found out to be a thief, anyone can get you. Okay, you were going up in somebody's locker or stealing someone's shit, and let's say you're a white guy and you were trying to steal a black guy's shit, that black guy can beat the fuck out of you, and there wouldn't be any repercussions on him because you were a punk ass thief. Okay, so thieves didn't get any love, and they were the ones that anyone could get. Okay, now the races had shot callers. I'm going to do another episode specifically on this subject because it deserves its own talk, essentially. But shot callers were the guys that, it was a political position. So they were the guys that were in charge. So if there was something that was happening, let's say like a riot was about to kick off or whatever, they'd let people know like, hey, get suited and booted, meaning, get your clothes on, get your state issue boots on because it's about to go down, right? But mainly it was a political position, meaning that if there was some problem, like let's say a guy bought drugs, a white guy bought drugs from a black guy, okay? The white guy didn't pay. Now, before a riot kicks off over it, what would happen would be that whoever didn't get paid, they'd go to their shot caller. So the black shot caller would hear the problem and he'd come over and he'd talk to the white shot caller. Hey, this guy over here owes money. You need to get this guy to pay. And typically what would happen is the white shot caller would go to the guy that owed money and he'd be like, hey man, do you owe money to this race? Because you need to pay up because we don't want to riot over this shit. And if for some reason, let's say the white guy couldn't pay, then they'd beat his ass and they'd roll him up off the yard. However, that didn't guarantee that there wouldn't be a riot. That was just the race handling their dirty work, taking out the garbage, so to speak. But largely, being a shot caller was a political position. Now, I will say this. A lot of people, you'll see it in the movies or whatnot, or hear stories about it, like the shot callers were some kind of fucking criminal masterminds that, they were the smartest and the best and they knew how to run shit. Nah, man. That's the smart people didn't want to be shot callers because the cops knew who the shot callers were too. And you didn't want, if something kicked off, the cops coming to you and being like, oh, okay, well, you're the one in control of all these whites or whatever. And, the riot happened. So now you're in trouble too because you sanctioned it. Also, what would happen too is like, let's say there was a riot that happened. Everybody, they broke it up. They pepper sprayed everyone. Everybody's locked down, right? When the cops wanted to make sure it was cool, they'd call the fucking shot callers to the office or to whatever. Hey, so-and-so, come down. They call over the PA system in the building. Hey, come down to the podium. We need to talk. So it was like, it was a position that you had to deal with the cops. And real convicts didn't want to deal with the cops. So basically, the shot callers were the dudes that were kind of dumb, didn't really have anything going on the streets, okay? But because now they're in prison and they got a position to where they can tell dudes what to do or whatever, now they feel like they're about something, and so they take the position. But real convicts, like real dudes that were about the shit, nobody wanted to be a fucking shot caller. So that's essentially how the races worked, okay? It's a very racist environment in prison, at least in California prisons. There is no friends, and that's not just with other races, but that's with your own race. And it's not a place where you want to go if you're one that's inclined to be friendly with everybody, or you've got, let's say you're a white guy who's got a black wife on the streets or something like that. Not something that's going to be good for you on the inside. But hey, listen, there's going to be more on this with the shot callers, with some other stuff. I've got a whole bunch of subjects that have been sent in, stuff that I'm scripting out and working on to talk with you guys about. So stay tuned. There'll be more. And until next time, stay safe out there.